Good evening, children. It's Granny MACDUFF, ready with a story. So make yourselves comfy, and I'll begin. Once upon a time, a great man took a second wife, an unpleasant woman who brought with her 2 daughters who, like their mother, had the most terrible tempers. The man also had a daughter, a girl who was kind and loved by all. Her stepmother grew jealous of the affection the child received from her father and became angry with how the girl's good nature made her own daughter seem all the worse. And so the stepmother put the girl to work in the house, giving her the most difficult tasks. She was made to wash the floors, clean the dishes, and polish the silver. She slept on a mattress made of straw in the attic, while her stepsisters slept in rooms of the highest fashion. The girl dared not complain to her father, for he was ruled by his new wife and would surely scold her. After her work was finished, the girl would sit among the cinders near the fireplace to keep warm. The soot often made her appear dirty, and so her mean stepsisters began to call her Cinderella. But for all their fine clothing, the girl's beauty came not even a bit close to Cinderella, dirty or not. Then one day, it was announced that the king was giving a great ball. He invited all the ladies in the land so that his son, the future king, may pick a bride. When the stepsisters heard of their chance to be the future queen, they nearly burst with excitement. They called Cinderella. "Come, Cinderella, comb out our hair, fasten our dresses, buckle our shoes. We're going to a ball at the palace." Cinderella helped the girls, but afterwards she wept, for she too wanted to go to the ball. She asked her stepmother, "Stepmother, please, do allow me to go to the ball." Her stepmother laughed and replied, "You, a ball? Just think, a filthy maiden with no shoes at a ball in the king's palace. You would only be laughed at." Cinderella watched as her stepsisters rode away with their mother in a grand carriage. She began to weep. But just then, her fairy godmother appeared by her side and asked, "Why are you crying, my darling girl?" "I should like to go to the ball, godmother," Cinderella cried. "Well, then you shall." For the first time in a long time, Cinderella smiled. "Go into the house and fetch me the biggest pumpkin you can find," Fairy Godmother instructed. Cinderella did as she was told. Fairy Godmother placed the pumpkin just outside the door, and with a flick of her wand, the pumpkin began to grow, and within an instant, it became the most beautiful coach. "Bring me the mousetrap, dear girl," Fairy Godmother asked. And the girl obeyed, placing the trap with 6 mice inside just beside the coach, as well as the rat trap, which contained 3 rats. "I thought perhaps they may be of use," said Cinderella. "And they shall," Fairy Godmother replied. "Go and find 2 lizards." Cinderella obeyed. Fairy Godmother opened the door and pointed her wand at each mouse as it came out, turning them all into the most beautiful dapple grey horses. Then she took out the largest of the rats and turned him into a coachman. Cinderella returned with 2 lizards, who almost instantly became footmen. "And now, child, you are ready." "But, Fairy Godmother, how am I to go in these clothes?" "Quite right, my dear." And Fairy Godmother tapped her wand to Cinderella's shoulder, and she was no longer in a ragged dress, but a beautiful gown made of the finest material, and on her feet were a pair of the most delicate glass slippers that sparkled like diamonds in the moonlight. Cinderella was the most beautiful girl in all the land. "Now, my dear, promise me you will not stay 1 second past midnight, for at midnight the spell will break and you will all go back to your true forms." "I promise, godmother." Cinderella was filled with excitement, and before she knew it, she was stepping out of the carriage and into the great hall of the palace. All at once it was silent and still, for all eyes were on Cinderella. The young prince could not take his eyes off of her. The girl's stepmother and sisters thought nothing of this new presence, for they did not recognize Cinderella and assumed she was home cleaning the floor. The prince walked straight to her. "May I have this dance?" he asked, offering his hand. Cinderella accepted the prince's hand. The music started once again, and the pair began to dance. She danced with such grace, not even the king himself could tear his eyes away. The entire evening, the prince would allow her to dance with no one but himself. But Cinderella had forgotten the time, and suddenly, the first stroke of midnight began. She bid the prince farewell and quickly departed. The prince followed her, but he could not catch her. As she ran down the steps of the palace, one of Cinderella's glass slippers fell off of her foot. The prince picked it up with the most tender care. Cinderella was not even at the gate of the palace when midnight struck, and she was once again in her ragged clothes. The prince asked his men at the gate if they had seen which way the coach had gone, but they told him they had seen no one leave but a peasant girl in tattered clothing. Cinderella waited for her stepsisters to arrive home, and when they did, she asked, "How was the ball?" The girls told her it was the most elegant affair they had ever attended, and that the most beautiful girl anyone had ever seen was there and danced all night with the prince. Cinderella asked, "And will she be the prince's bride?" The girls replied that they indeed thought so, until the girl ran away at midnight. They told Cinderella how the girl had lost a glass slipper, and that the prince held it with him the rest of the night, for he was most certainly deeply in love with its owner. And so what they said proved to be true, for the next morning it was announced that the prince would take for his bride the maiden whose foot fit the glass slipper. The whole of the king's court tried on the slipper, but not one foot did it fit. The prince began to travel the country, asking each maiden he could find to try the shoe. Finally, the prince and his men arrived at Cinderella's home. The two stepsisters did everything they could to squeeze their feet into the shoe, but it was no use. The shoe did not fit. Cinderella watched from afar, and when she saw the prince, she stepped forward and asked, "May I see if the shoe will fit me?" Her stepsisters laughed. "You, Cinderella! What business would you ever have with a prince?" The prince stood and looked at Cinderella. There was something about her, and so he knelt at her feet and presented the shoe. Cinderella raised a foot, and the shoe slipped on perfectly. The prince stood and looked into her eyes. This was the girl he had danced with at the ball. This was his one true love. The stepsisters were in shock, for they could not believe Cinderella was the girl in the golden gown. They threw themselves at her feet, but before they could say a word, she looked upon them and said, "I forgive you." And with that, Cinderella rode off with the prince on his horse. 3 days later, the two were married. In front of the entire court, the prince sealed their love with a kiss for all to see. And they lived happily ever after. The end. And now it's time time to take a deep breath and close our eyes so that we may drift off into a world of our own adventure. Good night, children.